This is the change that needs to happen for every single business, and this transformation is inevitable. There's no question whether we're going to go into this sustainable mode of the economy. There's already plenty of examples of how profitability also means sustainability and vice versa. And this is only going to expand further as from next year onwards, all this legislation in the EU, in the UK kicks in, and then thereafter in the US and then in Asia.
Gewinne Zukunft, der Podcast, der dich dabei unterstützt, dein Unternehmen erfolgreich klimakompatibel zu gestalten. Hier lernst du direkt von den Menschen, die die Nachhaltigkeitstransformation als Pioniere entscheidend vorantreiben. Mein Name ist Zackers und ich freue mich, dich mit an Bord zu haben.
I'm very grateful that IBM supports me on my mission. Hence, as before every episode, you'll get an insight into an IBM sustainability offering in the field of this episode's topic in just under 90 seconds. This time, I'll tell you about Kaya & Kato, a label that put extreme effort in producing very sustainable work apparel. Their challenge, however, when it comes to sustainability, the fashion industry is literally the wild, wild west. Large companies simply come up with creative marketing claims such as conscious wear, eco-design, or simply climate neutral without having any substance behind it. So how could consumers differentiate a greenwashing approach from Kaya & Kato's quite valuable contribution? Together with their sustainable textile provider Cotonea and IBM, they deployed the IBM Business Value Design method. In the end, they created an incorruptible blockchain platform that allows them to transparently document every single step in their supply chain, from all the way in the beginning, the ecologically and sustainable farming of the cotton, through the processing, dyeing, weaving, all the way to the sewing and assembling. Just by scanning a simple barcode, now their customers can get an insight into the full story of their purchase. Oh, and by the way, authorities in, for example, the UK and the Netherlands have started to clear up this wild, wild west and slapped huge fines on large global fashion companies for misleading their consumers with their claims. So if, like Kaya & Kato, you too want to communicate your actual contribution to sustainability, click on the IBM link in the show notes. And now enjoy the actual episode, which, as you probably already noticed, will be in English for a change.
There she stood, on probably one of the most unruly, unusual, yet most fun startup events in Germany, the Pirate Summit. During a literally fiery pitch competition with the befitting name of Walk the Plank, she and her co-founders just had pitched their young startup called PlanA. They knew that with a SaaS approach, so software as a service approach to ESG reporting, carbon tracking, and decarbonization, they were on to something that the world was waiting for. But little did they know what kind of stunning trajectory their pitch and the more than relevant solution they had in their hands would launch them onto. The woman of this little story is called Lubomila Jordanova. That pitch happened in 2018, and now in 2022, it's really hard not to know her because she literally is on every list that counts. May it be Forbes 30 Under 30, MIT Tech Review Under 35 Innovator, may it be lists by BCG, McKinsey or Handelsblatt. Her and her co-founders literally won almost any award there is. And not only did they and do they continue to win awards, but most importantly, of course, they are already working with large corporates on their sustainability efforts. So I'm really looking forward to hear from her personally how corporates actually can leverage digitalization to decarbonize and what kind of immense risks they are facing if they do not do so. Welcome, Lubomila.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So, Lubomila, if you think back to that moment, I mean, by now your portfolio is really big. But what exactly did you focus on back then, and why was it so relevant to so many companies?
In 2018, when this competition was happening, we were pitching, I was pitching a solution for climate risk assessment for businesses, where you would use a lot of data, as we do even today with our software, to identify what are the biggest levers for improvement for businesses, where they could be losing money down the line because of the fact that they are not prepared well enough for climate. Down the line, we quickly learned that businesses were not particularly prepared to think that much in the future. So we needed to shorten the timeline and make our software have a more specific focus on the status quo. So analysis of the current environmental performance of a business, and then automatic prescription on how the business can improve.
That's quite interesting. Let's maybe dive into that, and then we'll come back to how it actually ties together with digitalization as a transformation. So you're focusing on ESG reporting, on carbon tracking, and on decarbonization. So those three fields sort of go hand in hand together, but not necessarily, I guess.
There's a few different groups, and the dynamics, obviously, in the way they think significantly different. For some, sustainability is a tick of the box. It is assessment of how legislation is going to impact the business, and therefore, as a result, certain steps are being taken, which obviously is preparing a report. It is getting data from your portfolio. If, let's say, you're an investment fund, as quite a few of our clients also fall within this category. This is the, I would say, type of client or type of engagement where there's clear regulatory pressure and there's clear need to understand this regulatory shift so that the company becomes compliant. A second type of client that we often see is the businesses that are pressed to think about sustainability more proactively by their employees. This is usually the case where there's a green champion, there's a group of people within the employee realm which is focused on finding solutions for the business, maybe even without budget, but then the management gets involved because obviously this is such a prominent topic these days. In these kinds of cases, there's usually a lot of kind of more grassroots approach of initiatives, and a few months or kind of projects down the line, it becomes a bit more of a formal project, which leads to, for example, a solution like ours being adopted. And there is also a type of company that is probably the most, I would say, mature part of the spectrum, where you see businesses understanding that there's a lot of money that they could lose if they don't prepare for the transformation needed in order to become planet positive, prepared for climate risk. And these are the cases where businesses are assessing all the unintended costs that they can accumulate if they really don't understand what is the status quo at the moment. We've seen a lot of this in fashion companies because obviously when you have supply chains that are being impacted, maybe because of the geographical distribution of your partners by climate risk, you essentially start seeing that this could destroy the steps that you need to take in order to be successful. We also see it a lot in the financial sphere because obviously financial risk also includes climate risk. And also we see it with a lot of companies that are just in a way too big and have a lot of different stakeholders, suppliers, even types of businesses that they need to navigate, which are maybe their subsidiaries and so on.
But how do you actually move through that? Because I assume you try to automate as much as possible, but specifically like you say a fashion company, and often, I don't know, the cotton gets produced in Egypt, it gets maybe dyed in India, and it gets sewn together in Bangladesh, and then it gets flown or shipped back to Europe. It's so many stations that such an item goes through, and I guess not all of it is digitalized. What's like the average level of maturity of, for example, a fashion company? So where are they usually at? What can you work with?
Fashion companies are actually quite advanced, especially from the more popular ones, because in the last 5 to 10 years, e-commerce has exploded and it has pushed all of these companies to really become digital native. Many of them are using as the first sales channel the online option, which means that they need to understand on how to navigate their whole organization that, yes, relies on physical products at the end of the day. But in order for these physical products to get into the hands of clients, they need to be really digitally advanced. What this has meant is that when it comes to any kind of reporting, when it comes to any kind of data collection, they are not hearing this for the first time. Fashion industry has been really interesting as well, because they were probably, after the financial industry, the first ones to be on the receiving side of a lot of pressure. When you work in the B2C segment in particular, you get a lot of customers sharing their opinions online. And now that Gen Z is essentially defining the way big brands think, and they are making choices out of their consciousness, out of their values, you don't have a choice but to also think about sustainability proactively. I'm skipping the whole discussion about fast fashion because this is not a segment we work with, and I wouldn't be able to cover a lot of ground on how advanced they are on the data side of things, but I can definitely speak about the more kind of mid to large scale segment on the kind of mid to high level price where there's a lot of advancement digitally, and sustainability has been a step that needs to be taken because of all the pressure, but it's not something that feels incredibly unfamiliar because they've gone through other types of digitization.
Actually, that's something where, of course, you cannot speak about it, but I really would love to hear your assessment. From what I take, as you said, you would not work with a company such as Shein, for example, which is not only fast fashion, but ultra fast fashion. But what's really interesting here, and I would like to hear your opinion on that, is that I also had that in the other episode where it was about banking, and you really see the difference in users between an ready, available, fully competitive impact mobile banking provider and just your average non-sustainable provider. And the latter just has 100,000 more users on their platform. And at the same time, you see a ultra fast, absolutely unsustainable, it may be ecological or social company like Shein dominating the Amazon store, being valued 30 billion, really going through the roof. So how does it play out that on the one hand, Gen Z is so active in media, and then actually at the counter, the young generation still seems to buy absolutely unsustainable products?
We have been building this economy in the way that it has been built for the last decades, and that has been with the pure optimization against one KPI, and that's been money. With this in mind, what we have achieved is really a lot of clear definition of success around this metric, and also a lot of obviously businesses being built around this model. I am not naive to think that every single person on this planet thinks in a sustainable manner, which is why I'm not surprised to know about the success of this company that you mentioned. And I can assume that this kinds of models are going to stay for at least another few years until the whole legislation doesn't fall in place properly, and they don't get squeezed into working only in geographies where this kind of behavior is still acceptable. One of the biggest benefits and one of the biggest points of excitement that I have in my life is really feeling how with every single company from the thousands that we've worked with, you see the change happening through the steps that they take. This is the change that needs to happen for every single business, and this transformation is inevitable. There's no question whether we're going to go into this sustainable mode of the economy. However, we need to also understand that there will be a lot of cutting corners. There are going to be a lot of falling through the crack kind of approaches where sustainability is not going to be the first value proposition at the get-go. There's already plenty of examples of how profitability also means sustainability and vice versa. And this is only going to expand further as from next year onwards. So this legislation in the EU, in the UK kicks in, and then thereafter in the US and then in Asia, which is where these kinds of legislations are lined up. This domino effect from the legislation goes after into the consumer preferences, in the investor preferences, and ultimately it is kind of a cycle that will lead even these kinds of companies to have to make the maybe uncomfortable choice of not being able to pollute at that scale.
Would you say that maybe even more than consumers, that investors are the biggest pressure point at the moment because they're really concerned that they put their money in an unsustainable business, which then in turns and in some years down the road will really feel the pressure? I mean, at the moment already there's really headlines of companies getting into funding trouble if they do not have a very clear sustainable strategy. Even down to in Germany, like to an IHK level where like regional IHK groups already have meetings on that topic. And if like a regional group for carpenters and small businesses really has a meeting on it, that to me tells me it is really happening.
I think investor pressure is definitely one of the biggest drivers. And the reason for this is that investors are understanding that climate risk is financial risk. At the moment, we do not have embedded in our accounting systems ways in which in an automated, optimized way, we can calculate what is the unaccounted for capex that would end up on the bottom line of companies and obviously on investors' bills, because maybe the destroyed infrastructure for climate change has not been accounted for. Maybe the destruction of certain supply chains because of natural disasters or, again, other negative impacts of climate change has not been assessed properly, and therefore it has not been added to the bill. The investors are understanding this. They're educating themselves. They're spending a lot of time on developing frameworks and also using these frameworks to then assess their portfolios. Where they're having challenges at the moment is really on navigating all the different options that they have for frameworks that they can adopt and then they can use to assess who is better prepared than another and therefore decide where they should put their money. We have still, I would say, a long way to go until we are fully aligned on the language, because we still speak multiple languages, even in the investor sphere, when it comes to ESG. But what is definitely there is the understanding of the losses that can occur with statistics as bombastic as 300% increase in climate risk associated costs only in the last few years, which is what insurance companies have been bearing at this point.
I would like to actually focus on that, and also because you started your statement with that a minute ago, disruption of the supply chain or of the stock. So could you just, for us to have a real image in our head, tell us what that could mean? Is it, for example, you have a big drought in Italy and there's not enough water for the fields? Or what does it really mean? What kind of scenarios are risk scenarios caused by climate change?
Climate change is not one issue. It is a collection of issues that have been developing and evolving over decades, and they are the result of billions of, so to say, wrong decisions that we've made. One of the best illustrations of this is the plastic patch in the Pacific Ocean, where essentially you see all these little pieces of straws or even a washing machine or packaging from products that we've used, like cosmetics and so on. And that is not to put the blame on the individuals, but really to show that kind of a chain of wrong decisions have been made from the producer, from the person that has created this packaging up until the point of how it was disposed and it was not recycled, from the consumer or whoever used that. Where this is leading us to is essentially the destruction of our ecosystem. Our planet is at this point getting vulnerable. And what this means is that the resistance that it was able to demonstrate by taking in CO2, like, for example, what the oceans do, where from the atmosphere, they take the CO2 and kind of absorb it. Or where big ecosystems like the Amazon forest has been historically absorbing a lot of CO2. At the moment, it is emitting CO2 because of essentially this balance that has been achieved. Where this is leading us to is on a more fundamental level, average temperature increase and a lot of extremes in the particular geographies that are already quite vulnerable. The most exposed part of our planet is the global south, where already there's been absolutely unbearable situations at 47 degrees, 50 degrees in some countries in Africa. But it is also leading to a lot of unexpected extreme events, like, for example, the heat waves that we experienced in the last few weeks in Europe, the floods that we experienced in Germany. And I can list a lot of different events, like there's been floods in India, there's been literally islands that have disappeared. So ultimately, where this picture that I'm painting is taking us to is an ecosystem that is out of balance, which means that this ecosystem is creating a lot of instabilities and vulnerabilities in the different geographies. And depending on what this geography is normally known for, it takes this geography into an extreme of that. You see desertification, you see heat waves, you see a lot of drought, and so on. And if we think of the normal life that we live, this means that a lot of the different elements of it, being able to access a lot of diverse food, being able to drink fresh water, being able to travel and create supply chains that are undisturbed, being able to live a life where essentially everything has seasonality, it's gone. So this is where we're headed, and unfortunately we're on a trajectory to surpass even the worst scenarios that scientists have offered us.
I believe a successful sustainability transformation can only be achieved if we all work together in a supportive ecosystem. Hence, I also use every episode to recommend a free of charge tool, a valuable resource, or an NGO supporting you on your transformation. My shout out in this episode goes to probably one of the most important voices when it comes to sustainability, the Club of Rome. It's hard to believe that it literally has been already half a decade since they first raised awareness for the issue of sustainability. Their first report was launched in 1972 already. Now, 50 years on in 2022, we are still in a dire crisis and still seem not to have learned our lesson yet. Fortunately, though, there still seems to be reason for hope. At least according to their latest book, Earth for All. Earth for All just came out mid-September, so actually I haven't been able to read it yet while recording this episode, but I'm quite certain it is one of the most important books to read this year. Using powerful state-of-the-art computer modeling, a group of scientists and economists from around the world present 5 extraordinary turnarounds to still achieve prosperity within our planetary limits. If you want to find out what the 5 system-shifting steps are to achieve this and how you can contribute to it, then I highly recommend to order Earth for All by the Club of Rome. You can find a link in the show notes. This was my shout-out, and before I continue with Lubomila, if you've liked the episode so far, make sure to hit the subscribe button. And of course, I would be more than thrilled if you also leave a rating and feedback in your podcast app. Thanks a lot. Let's continue. Of course, there is just the pure question of human existence around this. But if we break it down really purely through a business lens for the moment being, and with your insights into all the risk assessments, which are the most top 3 immediate risks that will hit us from what you mentioned? Is it, for example, there won't be enough, I don't know, just putting it out there and you correct me, fishes because there's too much plastic and not enough plankton in the sea? Is it the heat wave in India will be too big and workers won't be able to actually work in the fashion companies? Or is it such as we had here in Germany in Ahrtal, this massive weather events? Which specific companies or businesses will be disrupted the most immediate?
So the effects of climate change inevitably will impact all of us. And I really want to emphasize on this because it is really wrong to start single-handedly selecting one or another industry, because all of our industries are intertwined. If I take the finance industry is funding the climate action success or the climate action failure in a way, because it is the biggest investor in fossil fuel companies, but also it is the one that is going to support with sustainable finance the transition that we need to go through. If you take the fashion industry, this is deeply embedded into transport, logistics. It is deeply embedded into natural resources that are related to the materials where the biggest amount of CO2 emissions come from. If I take agriculture, that is actually heavily dependent on fresh water, heavily dependent on stability of the weather conditions, you have, again, transportation. You have, again, a lot of supply chain dependencies related also to the healthiness of the land. So I wouldn't pick one particular industry. I would probably say that the three global risks that we have at the moment are A, climate action failure. This is within the realm of our hands. And I think it's still where we can find hope, because there is something that we can do as businesses. As businesses, we need to be prepared for what our business, our industry means in the context of climate change and the negative impacts that we might have, and start acting on mitigating those. But it is also about businesses educating their suppliers and partners and employees about what does this mean in the longer term. And unfortunately, longer term, I want to again kind of emphasize on this, is not decades. It's really the next 5 years. The second big challenge is related to just general productivity loss related to extreme weather events and general human loss. At the moment, we have had just over the last few months an absolutely unheard of number of people that have died. Like only last week, there's been a few thousand people that died in India because of floods. Like there's been just a lot of these events happening all around the world. And all these people are part of someone's workforce. They're part of someone's supply chain. And they are based all over the world, not only in Asia, but in Europe. There was multiple examples from the US from the last few weeks where people working in the logistics sector would faint because of the heat waves. So that might not feel really relevant when you're working in a comfortable office in a city like Berlin or London, but it is in one way or another embedded into the chain of any funding vehicle, any industry. And one I think issue and a final one that I feel is often undermined and disregarded is the one of biodiversity loss. So our ecosystem is really dependent on all the different elements within itself, which means that if you take a field of corn, it is dependent also on the different insects and on the different animals that are there in order for the resilience of this ecosystem to be maintained. Where this is going to hit us really hard, and unfortunately it doesn't come only with this particular issue, is the agricultural sector, where certain foods are just not going to be available. If you combine this also with the war in Ukraine that we have at the moment, Ukraine is actually a massive producer, as well as Russia, of some very crucial types of food that are really at the key dependence of the existence even of some countries in Africa or even in Europe. You essentially end up with quite of a challenging situation. And it's not only about like, oh, I'm not going to be able to eat any more raspberries or whatever. It's really about like some basics missing from the table. So these are the three key climate risks that I would mention. Climate action failure, extreme weather events that lead to a lot of disruption on supply chains, human loss, as well as, of course, like financial loss associated to the fact that we're just not prepared for the effects of extreme weather events. And finally, biodiversity loss that leads to a destruction of the whole agricultural industry, but also of the whole ecosystem, which by weakening the ecosystem further emphasizes on the negative impacts of climate change.
And it really comes down to very intricate things you would never be aware of. I know I learned in a fellow podcast, another German B2B sustainability podcast, that actually, for example, for chocolate, it comes down to only 2 specific insects actually pollinating the chocolate. It's not like there's a lot of redundancies in nature. You lose one link, and if we really only look at it through not a more moralistic or human, but just through a pure business lens, like a whole entire global industry depends on 2 specific insects. It's something nobody's aware of, and probably only realizes it until it's too late. But if we go back to where we started, and that was, okay, so across various industries, you aggregate data. You might aggregate data within the company from suppliers. And maybe if we stick with a fashion example, because that's just what we started with, like what actual levers do they then have to decarbonize?
So once the data has been assessed and a business has a good overview of the scope 1, 2, and 3, which maybe just for the benefit of the audience, I'll explain what it means. There's 3 layers of emissions that any business has. And the first one is focused on emissions from facilities and vehicles. Scope 2 is related to purchased electricity, heating, cooling. And then scope 3 is related to suppliers and investments, logistics, and the use of products, and also work from home, emissions associated to travel, and so on. As you can hear from the different categories, obviously different elements of scope 1, 2, and 3 are applicable to different industries. In the fashion example, obviously, the suppliers, the materials, like these are the logistics and the use of product. These are the key levers for improvement. When we work with sustainability topics related to the fashion industry, once the assessment has been done, what usually shows up automatically on the platform as the most optimal pathway for decarbonization is related to energy within the supplier consumption, because this is scope 3 category 1. And where we also see a lot of opportunity is improvement of materials. So our system is able to identify the materials that are contributing with the most amount of CO2 emissions, and it suggests alternatives. So maybe you're using one type of cotton, but then there's other alternatives to that. Leather is, for example, incredibly CO2 intense. Obviously, I don't need to explain that. There's now alternatives that are made out of mushrooms. So these are the kinds of things where our product is able to give suggestions that tangibly can demonstrate what are the levers for decarbonization, how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take to implement.
Okay, I can get that. So it's not just the easy bit. It's not just changing from your coal electricity supplier to your solar electricity supplier. It's really about reducing it in the supply chain, in the production process, in reducing the energy, replacing materials with, for example, a non-leather variant, etc., etc. Also, again, coming back to the business case, because as you mentioned, some have the intrinsic motivation to actually start climate action within their companies. Others are still more business driven and trying to cut corners. I assume that also there is a viable business case with reducing energy. That is an added benefit. You can actually lure companies into taking more action. Because I assume some, start that, ESG reporting is just a hassle. Now I need to pay 2 more staff in order to get all the reporting done. But can you actually show the viable business case in decarbonization?
There's a lot of different business cases of decarbonization, and where it really gets us excited is the fact that we don't need to spend a lot of time convincing businesses because they have seen a few of these elements. But if I can make it more practical, one of the main levers for companies to take action on emission assessment, climate planning, and also decarbonization is related to employees. Because at the moment, in any industry, you would be able to find one company doing exactly the same thing as you that is doing a lot of work on climate. And if you're the one that is not doing a lot on climate, there's a lot of likelihood that the employees that work for you are going to be willing to switch because they're not aligned with the values that you offer to them, but they have found an alternative. And obviously this staff is trained. You've put money into building them up, into creating them the environment so that they're happy, but also making them feel comfortable within the team in which they work. And this would be a massive loss. And we've seen this now in multiple companies that we work with, where the loyalty really increases if there's a lot of tangible action that the business is taking on climate. Another one that is even more practical, and maybe it's closer to the mind of someone, is we've seen now on average 20% reduction in costs associated to facilities because businesses switch to sustainable energy. This is due to the fact that if you install solar panels, you kind of, have the initial investment, but then you end up compensating over time. And down the line, this really reduces your costs. And a final example has been more what recently happened in some industries is especially on the branding side, on the way your brand is perceived. If you end up telling a sustainability story that is not backed by facts, you can end up in all of these greenwashing cases that at the moment are covered all over the news related to the finance industry, the fashion industry, and there's a lot of value wasted within that, because if you've built yourself up through a lot of marketing and so on to get to the point of being perceived in this way, if this is not backed by facts, you're likely to be, probably with less clients at the end of the day. And even if we go back to your example of the fast fashion company, this accumulates. Even if someone has ignored this news, it does accumulate down the line.
I had a lot of technical questions before I went in the interview, but it's so interesting that sometimes you end up with topics you didn't expect. For example, in one of my earlier episodes, I talked to René Schmidt-Peter, like a professor focusing on CSR and sustainable management. And he surprised me with the fact that the biggest challenge he and his colleagues see is actually educating the middle management on sustainability and making them climate literate. So is that something that you run into as well if you work with companies, that you actually feel like your counterpart in the company first needs some basic shift in the thinking, in the approach, and to get on board with basic climate literacy?
So that is definitely the truth in many ways, but I would definitely say that the overall picture is a lot more important, which is kind of, has there been alignment on the whole company level? Because the truth is that middle management is probably the one that is going to be implementing a software like ours. But if they don't have the management buy-in, they might not even get the chance to work with a software like ours. If they don't have also maybe enthusiasm on the employee side, they might not be able to get that. So I hope this kind of explains it.
I know companies put already a lot of resources and people on the digital transformation. Now comes the sustainability transformation, which first they probably think, okay, hey, let's put 2 people on it. Then they realize, okay, it needs to be a CEO priority. Wow, actually, I need to put staff and money onto it. But is there, because digital transformation and sustainability transformation really are so complementary? For example, you can work with a lot of AI. Maybe you have the data already, or maybe you finally have a use case actually to put that digitalization process to an actual purpose. So is there like a beneficial synergies between those 2 transformations that people might not be aware of?
Absolutely. We are on the receiving side of the benefits of digitization having happened in companies before we come, because they don't need to be explained the value of data, for example. They don't need to be explained the value of data assessment for decision-making. They also don't need to be explained why through digitization you can achieve better collaboration. So we are skipping these steps in the educational process for our clients, which makes it, of course, easier for us to do our job. But where we add value that goes beyond the traditional digitization evolution steps within a business is really explaining the benefits of these environmental, social, and governance KPIs as part of decision-making going forward. So it really isn't one one-off assessment. It really is something that is embedded in decision-making of a business. And we are super happy to be able to work with companies that are digital native because it makes our life a lot easier.
How significant would you say is, apart also from, of course, the way you were employed in Plan A, is AI in terms of really an effective lever for more sustainability because of optimization in supply chains, optimization in processes, optimization in server processes even?
AI is crucial for our technology because the decarbonization planning happens in the background with the use of AI, where we learn from all the different implemented plans that our clients would adopt and then kind of use in steps to decide where they essentially want to see the change and where they want to invest, to learn really what is the optimal way for a certain industry to achieve its decarbonization agendas. We have seen quite a lot of steps that are unusual in our minds based on the decarbonization team members that we have and their experience, which shows that technology actually has a big part to play in order to be really at the forefront of why you become successful at decarbonizing.
Do you have an example?
Just the decarbonization plans themselves, they're based on how the one company within one industry has been using them to then basically offer to the next company a better and improved plan, because through AI, we've learned what essentially has been implemented fastest as a task. How our decarbonization planning works is that based on all the data that has been gathered, we automatically prescribe a to-do list. This is essentially different steps that a business can take. And essentially this means that we have a really clear overview of the different building blocks of a decarbonization journey, but we don't know how this business is going to decide to implement them. They can prioritize one task over another because maybe now they have the resources to implement a solution for waste management or for renewable energy, or now they have the budget to organize specific plan or engagement for more sustainable commute and so on. We don't know how a business is going to decide to implement these steps. And through AI, by observing how they adopt and implement each one of those steps, we know then what is the optimal way for this to be done. And then the industries that we cover are essentially with a continuously improving plan, because essentially we have a really good overview of what has been done, how long did it take to be implemented, how many stakeholders did it involve for it to really work, and so on.
I know we're nearing the end here, so maybe as a last question, in your experience in PlanA, but you're also the founder of the Greentech Alliance, and you're part of so many dynamic projects in the area of decarbonization and sustainability transformation. In your work, maybe what is the most frustrating thing for you to run into, and how do you deal with it or solve it?
I've learned to not be frustrated continuously, because it can be quite disheartening to work in climate change, because there's a lot of different challenges. The news on one day is good, on another is bad. So you really cannot navigate your emotions if you really focus on what's going on the outside. But what continues to be I would say sometimes discouraging is the fact that we somehow still have the space to debate whether climate change is going to impact our lives or not, or we can postpone it for the next 10 years. I think there's no room for this. It's a bit of a waste of time to even spend our efforts on discussing this, because there's enough evidence, there's enough in our reality on a daily basis that we see, there's enough money that have been lost by businesses by now, there's enough legislation. So clearly there's alignment in the general thinking by businesses of why this matters. So better focus on the action bit. This is where I still maybe sometimes get a bit worked up.
So that's frustrating, and your way to solve is that you really focus on what you can actually do on the actions, and you actually contribute to the good news. I saw that on LinkedIn. You just recently started really every day, maybe 1 or 2 positive facts about what's happening in climate change to put it out there. So I can encourage our listeners to also follow Lubomila, because that really is a great source for articles. I even copy articles and use them as inspiration for my podcast on a weekly basis. Lubomila, thanks a lot, really, for joining me today.
Please continue doing so. We need to spread the word.
Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, I'll be more than happy if you hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And of course, I'd be thrilled if you leave a rating and feedback. My next episodes will be in German again. You can look forward to hearing from Elisabeth Goos, sustainability lead at IBM, who will talk about the significance of data and AI for the twin transformation of sustainability and digitalization. And I'll talk to Thorsten Schreiber of Africa Greentech